right, get ready for a deep dive. Today we're going to tackle something that'll really make you think. It's called the trolley problem. And no, it's not about runaway shopping carts at the grocery store.
Nope, not at all. It's a thought experiment philosophers love to debate. Okay, picture this. A trolley speeding down the tracks, out of control.
Oh, no.
And there are 5 people stuck right in its path. You're standing near a lever, and if you pull it, the trolley will switch to another track. But here's the catch. There's one person on that side track.
So it's like a no-win situation, save one life or 5. Sounds like a serious moral dilemma.
It is, and that's where today's deep dive comes in. We're going to look at this whole thing from the viewpoint of Islamic ethics, using the Quran as our guide.
Oh, interesting. So instead of just going with our gut feeling, we'll see what kind of guidance the Quran provides on handling this kind of tough choice.
Exactly. That's where the idea of reflective equilibrium comes in. We'll start with our first reactions to the trolley problem, and then see how they match up with the teachings and principles found in the Quran. It's all about finding that balance between our gut instincts and our deeply held beliefs.
Okay, you got me hooked already. But before we get into specific trolley problem situations, can you give us a quick rundown of the key Islamic principles we should keep in mind?
Absolutely. The Quran really stresses the sanctity of life. Every single human life is seen as sacred and inherently valuable. It's like a fundamental principle of Islamic ethics.
Yeah, that makes sense. But in this trolley problem, we're kind of forced to choose between lives. How do we square that with the idea that every life is sacred?
That's the core of the problem, and it's where the Quran's teachings on justice and fairness come into play. It's not just a numbers game, saving the most lives. We also have to think about our intentions and how the risks and harms are distributed.
So it's not as easy as saying, well, 5 lives are more important than 1.
Not at all. In Islamic law, for example, accidental harm is viewed very differently from intentional harm. Even if the outcome is the same, someone dies, the intention behind the action carries a lot of weight.
I see things are getting complicated quickly. And then there's this whole concept of qadar, divine decree. Where does that fit into this trolley problem mess?
Right, qadar. It's the belief that God knows everything that's going to happen. But here's the important part. It doesn't take away our free will or responsibility.
Oh, I see. So even though God knows the outcome, we still have choices to make. And those choices actually matter.
You got it. Our choices have consequences, even within the framework of God's will. In the trolley problem, it means that even if the final result might be predetermined, our intentions and our attempts to align our actions with Islamic teachings are still super important.
Wow, this adds a whole new layer to the trolley problem. It's not just about the immediate results, but about our intentions and whether they line up with Islamic principles.
Exactly. And as we dive deeper into different versions of the trolley problem, we'll see how these principles can guide us, even when we're faced with seemingly impossible choices.
All right, let's jump into those different scenarios then. Let's start with a classic one. You're standing by the lever, you can switch the trolley, 1 life versus 5. What would an Islamic perspective on this specific scenario look like?
Okay, well, even in this seemingly simple situation, there's a lot to consider. For instance, how sure are we that pulling the lever will actually save those 5 people? What if there's a chance the trolley goes off the tracks on that side and everyone gets hurt?
Good point. The trolley problem usually assumes these outcomes are certain, but in the real world, there's always some level of uncertainty.
Precisely. And from an Islamic viewpoint, we also have a duty to consider the potential harm our actions might cause, even if it's unintentional. It's not just about the numbers. We need to weigh the possible outcomes, the level of certainty, and the risk of unintended consequences.
Okay, so it's more complex than just picking the option that saves more lives. We have to think about potential unintended harm and how sure we are about the outcomes. It's interesting how Islamic ethics make us think beyond just a simple cost-benefit analysis.
You got it. It's all about making the most informed and ethically sound decision, taking into account all these factors within the teachings of Islam.
Okay, so we've just started to scratch the surface of how Islamic principles can inform our approach to the classic trolley problem. But there are even more difficult variations out there, right? Like the one where you have to physically push someone off a bridge to stop the trolley. I'm really curious to know how Islamic ethics would handle that one.
That one's tough, for sure. And that's exactly where we'll pick up in the next part of our deep dive.
Okay, so we've kind of dipped our toes into the classic trolley problem, looking at it from an Islamic perspective.
Yeah.
But you mentioned some even tougher versions. What about that one you brought up, the one where you actually have to push someone off a bridge to stop the trolley? I mean, does Islamic ethics even address something that intense?
It definitely pushes us to the edge of our moral comfort zone, that's for sure. And Islamic teachings have a unique take on it. Remember how we talked about the sanctity of life earlier?
Yeah, that every human life is precious.
Right, so intentionally taking a life, even if it's to save other lives, well, that raises some serious questions. It goes against the idea that we should avoid causing harm, the principle of non-maleficence.
So pushing someone off a bridge, even to save 5 other people, wouldn't fit with that principle.
It's very unlikely. Islamic scholars would probably say that it sets a dangerous precedent. If we say it's okay to take one life to save others in this case, then where do we draw the line? It could end up making human life seem less valuable.
I see what you mean. But what about those 5 lives that are lost if we don't do anything? Wouldn't that also be a kind of harm, something we're responsible for?
That's a good point, and that's where this idea of choosing the lesser of two evils comes into play. Islamic ethics recognizes that there are times when it's impossible to avoid harm completely.
So how do we choose the lesser evil then? Is there a way to figure out which action is more in line with Islamic principles?
It wouldn't be about just counting the number of lives. We'd have to look at the nature of the action itself. Intentionally pushing someone to their death, that's a direct violation of the sanctity of life.
Whereas letting the trolley keep going, even though it leads to a terrible outcome, isn't directly killing someone. Right?
Exactly. It's more of a passive form of harm. We're not the ones directly causing the death, even if our inaction does lead to that negative outcome.
Okay, I think I'm starting to understand how Islamic ethics handles these really tough moral questions. It's not about finding the perfect solution, but about choosing the path that causes the least harm and upholds the sanctity of life as much as possible.
I think you've got it. And this brings us back to that concept we talked about before, ijtihad.
Right, the process of making well-reasoned decisions when we're faced with really difficult situations.
Exactly. And this scenario shows us that ijtihad isn't just some theoretical idea. It's a practical tool that gives people the power to make informed decisions when there are no easy answers.
So in that bridge dilemma, a Muslim would be encouraged to use ijtihad to weigh the different choices, the potential harms, and the relevant Islamic principles to come to a decision.
Exactly. They might talk to religious scholars, study the relevant texts, and spend time in deep reflection and prayer to get guidance on which path is most in line with Islamic teachings.
It sounds like a process that requires a lot of personal responsibility and careful thinking.
It absolutely does, and it highlights how Islamic ethics isn't just about following a set of rules. It's a framework for dealing with complex moral dilemmas, encouraging individuals to think critically and make informed decisions.
So even in a thought experiment as extreme as this bridge version of the trolley problem, Islamic teachings can offer guidance and a process for reaching an ethical decision.
That's what's so powerful about it. It doesn't shy away from these tough questions. Instead, it gives us tools and principles to help us grapple with them in a way that aligns with our faith and values.
You know, it's interesting how these thought experiments, even though they're hypothetical, really make us examine our own moral compass. And bringing in the perspective of Islamic ethics adds a whole other level to that self-reflection.
It definitely does. It challenges us to go beyond our initial gut reactions and really think about the ethical implications of our choices, looking at them through the lens of our faith.
And speaking of challenging scenarios, is there anything else out there that really puts these Islamic principles to the test in the context of the trolley problem?
Well, there is one variation that kind of flips things around, making us face our own biases and assumptions in a new way.
Oh, I love a good twist. Tell me more. What's this mind-bending variation all about? So you're about to tell us about this trolley problem variation that flips the script. I'm curious, what's the twist?
Okay, imagine the same setup. A runaway trolley, 5 people in danger. But this time, the person standing alone on that side track, well, it's someone you deeply love.
Oh, wow.
It could be your parent or your child, your best friend, someone incredibly close to you.
Okay, that definitely changes things. It's not just a theoretical dilemma anymore. It's suddenly very personal and real.
Exactly. And that's what makes this variation so powerful. It makes us confront those emotions, those feelings that are part of decision-making, something that the classic trolley problem often doesn't really address.
So how does Islamic ethics approach this idea of emotional attachment in a moral dilemma? Does it acknowledge it?
It does. It recognizes that we're not just robots making purely rational decisions. We have feelings, we have attachments, and those things absolutely influence our choices. But Islamic teachings also emphasize balance and fairness.
So while it's natural to feel a stronger urge to save someone we love, we can't let those feelings completely take over our moral judgment.
That's the key. It's about acknowledging the emotional weight of the situation, but at the same time trying to apply the principles of justice and the sanctity of life in a way that's as fair as possible.
So even when it's a trolley problem with such personal stakes, we're still expected to consider the potential harm, think about the intention of our actions, and try to reach a decision that aligns with Islamic teachings.
Precisely. And this is where that concept of ijtihad, that process of careful decision-making we discussed, becomes so crucial. It's about seeking guidance from those who know more, reflecting deeply on the situation, and ultimately making a choice that we truly believe is the most ethically sound, even if it's incredibly painful.
I can only imagine how much internal conflict this kind of variation would create, and the need to seek guidance through prayer.
Without a doubt. It highlights that human side of ethical dilemmas. There's no easy answer, and Islamic teachings don't give us a simple formula. It's about navigating those complexities with sincerity, compassion, and a strong commitment to our faith.
It's been clear throughout this whole deep dive that Islamic ethics, especially when we view it through the lens of the Quran, doesn't just lay down a set of rules. It provides a framework for how to approach these really complex moral questions.
That's a great point. It empowers individuals to make informed choices based on their understanding of Islamic teachings and their own personal reflection. It's a dynamic process, not a rigid set of commands.
And I think what's so interesting is that even though this trolley problem is a thought experiment, these discussions about the sanctity of life, justice, and ijtihad, they have implications for our real lives too.
They absolutely do. They challenge us to really think about our own values and how we approach ethical dilemmas in our everyday lives.
So, as we wrap up our deep dive today, what's the main takeaway you'd like our listeners to think about?
I think the trolley problem, when we look at it from an Islamic perspective, reminds us that ethics isn't about finding those easy answers. It's about engaging in a constant process of reflection, seeking knowledge, and striving to align our actions with our faith and values, even when we're faced with the toughest challenges.
It's a powerful reminder that the path of ethical development never really ends, and the Quran offers such a rich framework to guide us along the way.
Beautifully said. And remember, you're not alone on this journey. Connect with your community, seek guidance from scholars, and trust in the wisdom and compassion that your faith provides.
Well, this has been a truly insightful and thought-provoking deep dive. Thanks for joining us as we explored the trolley problem through the lens of Islamic ethics.